So as Tanya said, my name is Jamie Lloyd-Smith, and I am the Community Mobilizer in the Social Development Department at the City of Penticton. So for those of you who may not know, this is a newly created position at the city. I've been in this role for about 3 months, and to be honest, I'm new to the community, so I've been in Penticton for about 3 months, and I'm loving being able to call this land my home, and getting to meet some of the residents and the people, and people like Tanya and community partners who are doing some amazing work in our community. So within my role, I have a very interesting position where I get to work with a lot of different community partners on this issue of housing and homelessness, and I get to look at sort of how that relates to the vibrancy of our city and community safety and the well-being of all Penticton residents. So I have a very unique role. So hopefully, our intent with this presentation is that, you walk away learning a few things that perhaps you didn't know about homelessness in Penticton. But I think as well, the second piece to that is we want you to feel somewhat hopeful about the path forward. As we were just mentioning, we know that the last 2 years has been tough times for communities and for individuals. And we definitely want to take this time to sort of highlight some of the amazing work that's happening locally. So as another aside, I'll preface this conversation by saying that while Tanya and I are by no means have all the answers to this work, we're very grateful to be connected to lots of communities across Canada who are doing this work and to learn and to share experiences from them. We certainly know that homelessness is not a unique problem to Penticton alone, but it's something that communities across Canada are really grappling with and trying to figure out sort of the best solutions with it. So with all of that being said, and before we actually jump into those 5 things that you may not know about homelessness in Penticton, I would be remiss if I didn't just chat a little bit about our local history. Oh. Tech issues already. No worries. Perfect, thank you. So as most of you will know, and probably many of you will know more than I do, if you're from Penticton, Penticton has historically been known for its beautiful weather and tourism. Oop, I'm going back. Thank you. Thanks, Chandra. What we don't often necessarily talk about when we think about all these things is sort of what Penticton has done to really build up sort of our social services. So actually going back to sort of the post-World War II era, so sort of thinking about 1940s, 1950s, Penticton, like many communities across Canada who were facing that economic scarcity, started to build out what we would now call our social safety net. So those services that really catch people if you start to struggle or if you need extra support. So some groups that were formed were the Business and Professional Women's Club. This is particularly timely today as I know it's International Women's Day. The Penticton Lions Club, the Knights of Columbus, and the Kiwanis Club, just to name a few. Going, fast forward to a few years there in the 1960s and 70s, Penticton also saw sort of an influx of seniors coming to the community, knowing that it was a beautiful place to retire, and there was certainly a need of senior housing in Penticton. That was also coupled at a time when tourism was really increasing, so not only did we have sort of a need for seniors housing, but also motels and places for visitors to stay. If we kind of go forward a little bit further into the 1980s and 1990s, we sort of saw a shift in sort of how homelessness services worked in a government level. So there's changes to sort of federal and provincial investments into social housing, and what this all really means is that, Penticton was growing sort of at the same time that nationally things are changing around sort of housing and homelessness. And the reason I wanted to mention this historical piece is I think it's really important to remember that, sometimes we get caught in the weeds of sort of what we're seeing maybe on the day-to-day, or we're thinking about things that are right in front of us, but there's actually a lot of historical pieces and a lot of groups that came together to really look at this issue decades ago, which kind of leads us to our first point about homelessness in Penticton.
So point number 1. Penticton has a dedicated group of partners addressing homelessness. And that group is called now 100 More Homes. And in 2016, we brought together over 25 community partners, both government and non-government partners, to look at housing solutions and solutions to addressing a homelessness emerging issue. And so in our first 18 months, we actually exceeded our goal of 100 homes, reaching 133 more homes. So the group put their heads together and said, you know, we've reached our goal. What do we need to do now? And do we dissolve or do we continue? And fortunately, the group looked at what's happening in community, the growing challenges, and we decided it was really important that we stick together and that we work with partners, government and non-government partners, to make a difference in the community. So in our time, we have looked at the complexity of homelessness, and that means that our response really takes the collaboration of both the government and non-government partners, and that no one organization can solve these challenges alone. In that first number of years, we supported multiple endeavors to build new housing of all types, and also a really important feature around collecting a robust set of data so that we can really understand the community and understand who is homeless and who is at risk of homelessness. And the group has been involved in a lot of conversations around how do we raise awareness and help and support awareness of the experience of people experiencing homelessness. And some of you may have attended a film that we hosted, Us and Them, and we hosted the film director Krista Lawton and had a conversation and talked quite a bit about what was happening in the community. Yes, just trying to switch slides. The questions are coming already. We have virtual participants too. Yes, so if we could hold the questions to the end, that would be wonderful. So we have this question, have we seen an increase in homelessness that is attributed to the new jail in Oliver? So we will get to the questions at the end. So in terms of, back one, our strategic goals, to be more clear about what we've been doing, is we've been looking at the top four things are to increase housing and supports for those experiencing homelessness, to create a coordinated system of intake, assessment, and supports, and to produce consistent and reliable data, and enhance communication and education in the wider community. And that's all, part of this conversation today, and some of the other things that we've been doing. But when I think about these four strategic directions, they have really guided all of the work that we've been doing, and we've made significant progress in each of those areas. But one of the pieces that we've been engaged with is that we've been working with a national organization also called Built for Zero, and they provide a lot of coaching to our leadership team, and we're going to talk a little bit more about their contributions later on in our presentation as well. Over to number 2.
There we go. Thank you, Tanya. So yes, second piece or second item that you may not know about homelessness in Penticton is that homelessness is a systems issue and not a housing issue. So what do I mean by that? So certainly we know that housing is a critical piece in terms of moving people out of homelessness. But when we actually think about addressing homelessness and ending it, we have to look at sort of those preventative pieces and ask those questions about why somebody maybe became homeless in the first place. So sometimes I like to think of this through the analogy of if you went home and you discovered that your floors were soaking wet, right? So you go home and you're like, oh no. Start gathering the towels, you're like cleaning things up, you're like, where's this water coming from? You gotta fix my floors. I'm not a handy person, but this has happened to me, and I bring someone else in to fix my floors for me, and I'm like, I don't want this to damage it, like what can we do? And then sort of at the end of all that, you're like, okay, but what caused this in the first place? Is it a leaky faucet? You might start asking those questions of like, where's the leak coming from? Or did my pipes burst? Like, is this, do I need new material for this? What's really causing it? And to this extent, I think we can think about homelessness in the same way. So, if we think about sort of that water damage as that time of crisis, when we experience or an individual experiences homelessness, we definitely want to make sure that we get them connected to supports and housing that they need right away. But in saying that, if that's sort of where we stop in our work, we're not addressing that issue of, well, what actually caused that water to create the damage in the first place. So back to sort of my little chart here. So when I say that homelessness is a systems issue and not just a housing issue, I mean that there's many different pieces to this puzzle that might indicate why a person experiences homelessness in the first place. So in the same way that we might ask those questions about where did this water come from, if we look at individuals experiencing homelessness, we might have questions about, well, what's their story? How does their story fit in with our education system, for example, or our justice system? How does that relate to income supports that they might be receiving, health supports? And I think this piece is really critical to what we're doing with 100 More Homes, and what partners are trying to do is to say, yes, we absolutely want to have that crisis response, and we want to house people, and we want to get them safe and affordable housing, but we also want to look at all these different pieces in the puzzle to figure out how these pieces can coordinate and integrate better to make sure that we have a really effective system. So as Tanya alluded to, 100 More Homes has done a really great job at supporting the development of some housing in our community. And again, I think what sometimes goes overlooked is that we could perhaps have a whole host of individuals who are at risk of homelessness that aren't always necessarily visible or even talked about. So just for reference, at least 16% of Penticton residents are living in what we would call core housing need. And core housing need refers to when an individual spends 30% or more of their total income in a month on housing needs. So that 16% number is certainly higher than the provincial average that we're seeing. And what that number really tells us is that there are some individuals who we know if they experience job loss, if a crisis comes up in their life where perhaps they can't pay their rent that month, we know that they're immediately sort of in that category of being immediately at risk of homelessness. So again, we want to look at sort of what are those root causes of homelessness, and what are all the different components of that system that we need to look at to make sure that homelessness doesn't happen in the future. And so in the same way that we want to look at that leaky faucet and sort of figure out what's going on, we want to make sure that we look at these different components and try to get them working together to prevent this. So I mentioned that, we have potentially a host of individuals who could be at risk of homelessness that we don't always talk about. And that sort of leads us to our third point about, what we think homelessness might look like in the community.
So are you going to give me a click there?
I sure am.
So most of you, when you look at this picture and you see this picture, this is what we think of when we think of folks who are experiencing homelessness, sleeping rough outside, potentially with overlapping mental health challenges or struggles and addictions and trauma. This is what we see. However, homelessness can also look like this, and this is what we're starting to see more of: sleeping on a friend's couch, bopping around from spot to spot trying to find cover, and getting with folks that we know to stay safe for a little while. And this is what we call hidden homelessness, which is really about people who are living temporarily with others, but without the guarantee of continued residency or immediate prospects for accessing permanent housing. And I think recently the city participated in doing some research with youth around youth homelessness, some of you may have seen, and a lot of young people talked about this particular scenario here. And we know that we need to, as Jamie said, look at what are the root causes and to really begin to address, where things start to happen. So number 3, hidden homelessness.
Which leads us very well into point number 4. That the item that you may not know about homelessness in Penticton is that, nationally speaking, nearly 50% of homeless adults experienced homelessness for the first time as a young person. And I want to pause there because I remember hearing this stat a couple years ago and thinking like, wow, there's a lot of young people experiencing homelessness, and that was so shocking to me. But I think the piece that sometimes gets overlooked here is that when we look at those adults experiencing homelessness, we have that kind of pause moment where we think, wow, like your experience may have started when you were really young, which tells us a lot about sort of those early experiences and how the sort of maybe trauma can actually lead you into experiencing homelessness adult. So as Tanya mentioned, our community did some amazing work in a study around youth homelessness in Penticton. That report, which is called Nowhere to Go, actually suggested that as many as 1 in 20 youth in Penticton may be experiencing homelessness at any given time. And again, you think about a young person being vulnerable, typically they're dependent on caregivers to provide that support. If you take away those really critical pieces at such an early age, you're highly vulnerable to perhaps fall into adult homelessness. We know that when youth don't have a stable or consistent residence or source of income, they're definitely vulnerable to fall into further trauma and into adult homelessness for sure. So this sort of leads us into our last point, which is probably not surprising at this point, which is talking about prevention. If we know that these things are happening and that there's an inflow sort of into homelessness, be that as a youth or an adult, what can we really do to solve it?
Yeah, complex problems, right? And when we look at how to solve complex problems, really prevention is the solution. And we often find, especially in my role in the not-for-profit sector, we're spending a lot of the time in the red and the blue and around the risk intervention and emergency responses. And really, in order to change the trajectory of things, we need to focus on those outer rings in terms of the social care system and prevention. And so I really love this slide in terms of helping us to look also the big things. It's like we need to wrap our arms around this idea and really get down to looking at the prevention and the community's response. And one of the things that in terms of 100 more homes that I feel really proud of is that, as I said before, both government and non-government, but in terms of having creative solutions and innovative solutions, one organization can't do it alone, and we need to work together. And there's so many talented organizations and committed individuals around the table to help us to look at how we might begin to tackle this particular challenge. And the other, I think, piece to notice is we spend a lot of time in the red and the blue, and it's also more costly, those kinds of responses. And when we start to look at looking at the green and the yellow, that my eyes are telling me it's yellow today, it might be orange, but those are the interventions, one, that are very caring and intervening early, and also in the longer run, they actually cost less to care for people.
So at this point, we've kind of quickly gone through those 5 things that you may not know about homelessness in Penticton. But as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, we certainly want this to be an opportunity to actually talk about some of the work that we've done and some of the paths forward that we're engaging in, and to celebrate sort of some of the successes that we've had. So to start, I want to talk a little bit about some housing solutions. I think, sometimes there's some buzzwords sort of thrown around. If you start kind of looking into this work around housing first or supportive housing or what those different pieces mean, I just wanted to take the opportunity to sort of go through those pieces. So Tanya mentioned early on, 100 More Homes has already sort of helped support the opening and housing of over 133 people through supportive housing programs. What's really important to notice when we talk about sort of housing solutions when it comes to homelessness is that there is not a one-size-fits-all. And we often kind of refer to this as sort of this continuum of housing, right? So like all of us in this room, we're going to have different unique needs, and that we want to live somewhere that's going to be suitable for our circumstances. That being said, what many people often sort of talk about, or perhaps you've heard this language, is around housing first. And housing first is both sort of a philosophy and actual program practice. So from the philosophical lens, housing first is this idea that housing is a human right, and that, you know, by virtue of being a human, we want to just sort of get you into housing without those sort of readiness requirements. So we're taking away those pieces that says you need to get a job first, you need to sort of meet all these requirements, and then we'll get you into housing. The basic idea is let's take you wherever you're at in life, whatever you're experiencing, and put you into housing and wrap supports around you. So sometimes the nice way to sort of think about it is housing first isn't necessarily just situated on the housing, it's around that supports that that individual gets. So if we move a person out of homelessness and into housing, we're wrapping around those supports, and perhaps that housing isn't appropriate for them, those supports would actually follow that person until we sort of find the right appropriate program for them. Supportive housing, which is probably what you've heard a lot about in Penticton, kind of combines those rental or housing assistance pieces with individualized sort of voluntary support services. So where I kind of just mentioned housing first is sort of those supports that might follow the individual in their housing journey. Supportive housing is those units that we have available for people who might be experiencing homelessness. And sort of the process for getting into those units is through a collaboration of partners in the community. So we really take a look at you know, who are the clients that we're serving and how can we best sort of match them to the services that they need. And then the last piece, of course, would be emergency response. So this, of course, would include shelters, as I'm sure you're all aware, but that would also include things like drop-in programs, meal programs, outreach service, which are absolutely critical, but we know that some of those pieces are actually taken away if you get housing, right? So if you're accessing a food bank or other sort of mental health supports, you know, housing can be that piece that eliminates your need for those services. The next piece is around data, and I'll let Tanya speak to this.
Yeah, so one of the pieces that we've taken on, and also really a lot with the support of the Built for Zero team, is looking at our data collection. And it's really important to have good real-time data and to understand who's in the community. So you might be wondering, and how many people, and you may have even heard some numbers, who are experiencing homelessness in Penticton. And we have done a survey every, I think 2 years it's been, which is called a point in time count. And we did this the last time in 2021 and concluded that in that particular survey that there were 118 people experiencing homelessness in Penticton. However, in terms of this particular tool, there are some flaws with it because the point in time count is just that. So it's on one day of the year, all in a certain period of time, all of the people that we can identify who are experiencing homelessness. So the last time we did that, the number was 118. And so that happens on one single afternoon and evening. So the challenge becomes, how do we end homelessness without really knowing the scope of the problem? And this is where the data collection comes in, and why being a part of Built for Zero is really helpful for us. And so they take a particular approach around really learning about each person who's experiencing homelessness in your community and learning their name, learning them by name, learning what their challenges are, how they've arrived at experiencing homelessness, and what their trajectory has been. And so in being a part of Built for Zero, we are looking at that real-time data, knowing who's in the community, also looking at who is coming into homelessness and who is moving from homelessness. So we're able to really understand all of what's happening in the community.
Yeah, and so in line with that work, another initiative that we're taking on that's pretty cool and innovative, I must say, is working with Help Seeker, which is a company in Canada that supports this work. And sort of the kind of rationale for why we got involved with Help Seeker is something that we heard from a lot of folks with lived experience of homelessness, which was, I want to get help, I'm struggling, and I don't know where to go to get help. I've certainly felt that in my adult life, and I'm sure many people have, where you're trying to figure something out in life and you're like, do I need to fill out this paperwork? Do I need to go talk to this person? And, then they're going to refer me over here to talk to this person. And Help Seeker is sort of meant to sort of address some of those needs, to actually help people find support very early on. We know that the longer that you experience homelessness, it's going to be more challenging to recover from that. So this is sort of an initiative of getting people connected to supports right away that are tailored to their needs. So I really like this diagram up here. You can kind of see there's a person sort of in what we might call an uphill battle sometimes, trying to find supports. You can imagine if you're on the street or you're very vulnerable, you might not have contact information. If you don't have a permanent place to live, gaining ID and some of those pieces are very, very challenging. So sometimes, the services you might need, they could be too far away. How are you going to get transportation to go see somebody to support you? Or sort of this item up here, perhaps you're not eligible for those services. And perhaps you might have to climb this whole mountain until you actually find out that you're not eligible for a particular service. So Help Seeker is kind of twofold. Sort of the cool thing about it is it sort of comes out in this form of an app. So, people who are working in the sector day to day, outreach workers, if they're seeing people who are experiencing homelessness, can also get kind of support. Where can I send this person? How can I support them? What's open? Are you hungry? What do you need right now? And we can kind of use that to sort of help get folks connected to support right away. The second really cool thing about this is it actually helps us sort of measure those data pieces that Tanya was talking about. So, it's really easy for Tanya and I to sit down and think, hey, maybe we need more money in this area, or we need more money in housing, or we need more money in food. But how can we really make that decision if we don't actually know sort of how those services are being used? So, once we sort of start to map out, hey, this is what a client's journey might actually look like through the homelessness system. This is sort of how many times we see people going to a food bank or looking up housing supports or these different things. It'll really help us in our decision making to know, hey, this is a service that's really overused. We probably need to nurture this a little bit, or this is one that's really underused. So sort of how can we make the best investment with our existing resources? So we've talked about this, we've talked about homelessness, we've gone over a little bit of, the overview of it and some things you may not know. And how often do we sit back and we kind of say, like, what does success really look like when we think about ending homelessness? Because when I started in this work, I thought it would look like this. I was like, this is amazing. I was super passionate about working around homelessness, and I was thinking it's going to be this straight line. We're going to get people into housing, they're going to be successful in their housing, and community partners are going to work together. The reality was that success sometimes looks like this, right? Like you zigzag and you think of this and you go back here and you chat about it. And the reality is, for those experiencing homelessness, success is going to look different. Like many of us have experienced the ups and downs in life, you might not be successful on the first attempt in getting housing, and that's okay. Sometimes you need to try and try again until you get it right. And I think for us who are kind of doing this work and trying to address this problem, it's the same thing, right? Like we go over these different solutions and figure out what's going to make sense. And as Tanya mentioned, sort of those pieces around having that data and that knowledge and the numbers to really back up our work, will hopefully help us move sort of from that squiggly line to the straight line. So at this point, that kind of concludes sort of the bulk of our presentation. We wanted to make sure there was time for questions, because I know lots of people will have that. But just before we get into that, I'll let Tanya sort of share kind of what you can do to support this work.
Yeah, our final 4 things before we jump into the questions and discussions around what you can do. And one is, if you are inclined on social media, like and follow 100 More Homes. And there are a lot of good articles and things that we're posting there about some of our links to the work that we're doing with Built for Zero as well. You could donate to the Kindness Meter, which is located outside City Hall, and all the funds will go to, they're held by United Way to support the work of 100 More Homes and our committee work. And thirdly is download the Help Seeker app so that you can know the services that are available for folks in Penticton. But finally, I would say the fourth and most important piece for me is practice kindness and listen, smile, and be kind. And everyone has a story. And when I've taken the time to understand people's stories and hear their experiences, no one woke up one morning saying, you know, I'm going to decide to be homeless today. There are some things that have happened to them that have resulted in them landing in the spot that they're in. And so just extend kindness and compassion and care. And with that, we'd be happy to entertain questions, comments, discussion.